Hi everyone, today I want to talk about my experience recreating the Instagram UI with Godot. Godot has a powerful node system to make UI, and I wanted to challenge myself to see how hard it would be to recreate part of the Instagram UI. I'm going to do a quick tour showing you how I recreated the UI and give you some tips along the way. Finally, talk about the limitations of using Godot to make apps. Let's get started. The first thing I did was take a deep look at Instagram to see how it was made and how the user interacts with it. I decided to recreate the homepage as it's the first thing a user will see and interacts with. I also wanted to remake the profile page because there's a lot of stuff going on, and especially this kind of double stages scroll. The first thing I did was identify all the icons used on these two pages. I headed to icon8.com and it was pretty easy to find nearly identical icons. Fluent style icons seems to be pretty similar, so I went with this, downloaded them, and make them white in Photoshop. The tip number one would be to think about the size of your icons beforehand. Have the icons that will be together the same size. It will save you some headache later. Next, I'm looking at what's making the page, how things are aligned and grouped. On the home screen, we see 4 groups. The first one is the top bar with the Instagram logo and the 3 icons to add content, access notifications, and DMs. The next one is the stories. It can scroll horizontally. The third is a vertical scroll container with the posts. Finally, we have the bottom navigation, allowing you to navigate to home, discover, reels, store, and your profile. We'll do the same thing with the profile page and then move on to Godot. Doing the same thing as before, we can see 8 groups this time. I told you, there's a lot going on there. At the top, we find a similar menu with the username and 2 buttons, one to add content and the other one to open a second menu. Next, if we ignore the View Professional dashboard that is only present when you have a pro account, we have the profile picture with different numbers, posts, followers, and following. By the way, I recently crossed 500 followers on Instagram. Follow me on there if you want more regular content. After that, there's the username with the bio, pretty simple. Next, we have a set of buttons arranged in a grid-like configuration. After that, we find the same horizontal scroll container as the stories, but with highlights this time. Next, we have a menu allowing you to switch between posts, IGTVs, and tags. Then a grid with all the users' posts. And finally, the same bottom navigation we saw on the homepage. When you scroll on this page, first the whole page will follow. And then when you arrive at the menu, just before the posts, the scroll will continue only on the posts. This is interesting and it will be cool to reproduce in Godot. When doing this analysis, it's important to see what's similar between the pages and even what's not moving, such as the bottom navigation. It will be easier to recreate the layout later on. To summarize real quick, we often see the same thing repeated throughout the layout. Things are either arranged horizontally or vertically. Some parts are scrollable, horizontally or vertically, and the bottom navigation is always present. Okay, now that we have all of that, we can go to Godot and start building the app. I won't go over all the project settings. The most important is the base resolution. I chose 1080 by 1920 with a portrait orientation. For stretch mode, I chose viewport and expand to allow for taller screens. I've created a base scene called app on which we'll have the current page and the bottom navigation, which should always be present. Talking about this bottom navigation, I've used a grid layout with 5 columns, with simply 5 textured buttons. I'm using the button in toggle mode, which allow me to have an icon for normal and pressed, useful to show when the user page is active. Using texture buttons is fine as I don't need to define hover and focus state. Also, the icon will stay centered when the button expands, which I didn't manage to do with a normal button. You don't need to worry about touch or mouse inputs for buttons, as Godot comes with mouse emulation from touch. It's a setting you can turn off if you want, but in this case, I find it pretty useful. All these buttons emit a pressed signal, and I then handle the scene switching in the app script. The bottom panel is anchored to the bottom and its size is fixed. Because it's the last child, the content of the page will always be displaced beneath it. The first page I did was the home page. To make the top navigation, I'm using the same principle as for the bottom navigation, but with an H-box this time. This is because I want some elements to take more space than others. The main content of the page is inside a scroll container and everything inside is in a V-box container. This will allow for vertical scroll. It's anchored to take the full screen and allowed to expand. The stories container is another scroll container, but horizontal this time. Each story is a separate VBox container with a texture button and a label for the username. Scroll containers works out of the box on both desktop and mobile, so it's very easy to develop for both platforms. The only thing you have to make sure is that all the control nodes have the mouse mode on pass or ignore, otherwise the touch input might not reach the scroll container. The next big chunk is the post. I made another scene for that just to keep things clearer. Godot is based around scenes, so you should try to make scenes as often as you can. That would be my tip number 2. It's way easier to reuse part of your apps and helps you make tidier structure. You're starting to understand how all of this works. You see that we'll have a VBox container to arrange the top bar, the pictures, the action menu, and finally the views and the description. There's nothing amazing there. The texture rect is holding the picture is set to keep aspects covered, which would clip the content if the image is bigger than what's allowed. This should not occur because your photo is cropped when uploaded, of course. To make the like animation, I simply use the texture rect with a heart icon and a tween to make the appearing and disappearing more pleasing. There's no built-in way to detect double tap from what I know, so I'm simply keeping track of the time between touch inputs. If it's lower than 500 milliseconds, which is the default delay on Windows, I'm counting it as a double tap and I start the animation. Finally, we have the profile scene. This one is the busiest and more complex to implement because of the 2 stages scroll. I won't go over the rest of the layout as it's pretty similar to what we've already seen. I'll focus on how I got the double stage scroll to work. At first, I thought it would be able to simply put 2 scrolls containers, one inside the other, and switch from one scrolling to the other, while keeping the scrolling position on the first one. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. When you have 2 scrolls containers imbricated and in the same direction, so here vertical, only one can be active, and when one becomes active, the other is losing its scroll position. The solution I found was to start the first scroll container scrolling normally. Once we reach a certain scroll position, which corresponds to the point where the post menu is at the top of the screen, I enabled the second scroll container. As I said earlier, the first container will lose its position, so I simply disable it, fix its scroll position, and make it not visible. Because it's not visible, the container will shrink and we'll only see the second scroll container. From there, I can scroll normally. But now we're stuck. I can't go back to the original scroll container when reaching the top. To fix that, I check the scroll position of the second scroll container and the scroll direction. If the second scroll container is at a scroll position of 0, we know we are at the top. We don't want to activate the first container each time we're at 0 though, otherwise it will flicker constantly. To check the scroll direction, on mobile I'm using the speed sign of the input event drag event. If the sign is positive, it means we are scrolling up. For desktop, I'm just checking the scroll wheel direction. If the 2 conditions are met, we can enable the first scroll container again and make it visible again. And with that, the double stages scroll works perfectly. That's all I've implemented for this UI recreation. Of course, if you'd like to make such an app, you would have to grab data from a server and make it dynamic. But if you create the static structure first, like this, it's not that complicated. You could easily instantiate a new post, feeding it data you grabbed from the server, such as the image, the description, etc. In conclusion, this was a nice little experiment. It was not too hard to make a good looking app, and Godot should be more than capable to make such apps. Of course, Godot was not meant for that, so you'll probably find stuff that could be done super easily with native development that will be a struggle with Godot. One thing someone pointed out was the lack of backstack, which is the history of where you went in the app, allowing you to go back. From what I know, Godot doesn't have this feature, so you would have to implement it yourself. If it's not done already, someone will probably make an add-on for that. Another point to consider is that right now, your app will be at least 30 megabytes even if you ship with only one page. That's because the whole engine is packaged in the app, even if you don't need it. So ideally, you should strip your binary from the unnecessary 3D or 2D stuff. That being said, I think this is a huge good point for Godot. Being a game engine first, you can make some pretty unique apps with 3D integration or even some nice effects and animation. I'm sure Godot will continue to grow and we'll see some nice apps made with it. If you know some that are made with it, please share it with me in the comments. I'd love to see it. I hope you liked this video. This was very fun to make. I've already remade the Tinder card swiping in Godot, so tell me in the comments if you want to see a video like this where I show you how I made it. As always, the sources are available on my GitHub, link in the description. Thanks for watching, see you later, bye!